Appreciate your introduction. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Let me see if I can get the whole thing shared. Maybe not. Okay, sorry. So this presentation has two parts to it. One is the idea of the pedagogy of reflective inquiry, which I derived from Betty Reardon, the peace educator, one of the founders of peace studies and peace education in the second half of the 20th century and Nobel Peace Prize nominee. So I build on her idea of the pedagogy of reflective inquiry, and then we'll apply that process of reflective inquiry to the questions of racism, racial inequity, racist policy, and anti-racist teaching. And the idea is that and at the end you'll experience in groups a taste of the pedagogy as much as we can in this short time we have. So that's the basic layout. The pedagogy of reflective inquiry, as conceived by Betty Reardon, is has two central influences, and one of them is John Dewey, and the other is Paulo Freire. Reardon's idea of reflective inquiry and a way of teaching is really very influenced by Dewey's idea that education is a process of the reconstruction of experience. That is, education is a process of developing the capacities, the skills, the understandings to engage in experience and to have more enriched experience as one develops. Dewey is often thought to have purported the claim that we learn by doing, and that's sort of right, but not very accurate. Dewey, a better statement would be that we learn and grow from reflecting on our experience of doing. So reflective experience is fundamental to the process of learning and development for Dewey. And that occurs through a participatory inquiry-based classroom, which leads to development. And it's a lifelong cycle. Paulo Freire's notion of critical pedagogy also has a deep influence on the pedagogy of reflective inquiry. And that's for Freire, his critical pedagogy is also reflective, but Freire adds a critical component, and we could suggest that Freire's critical pedagogy, looking at critiquing and analyzing structures of power and structural violence and cultural violence, leads to the development of a capacity for that critique, which is both empowering and liberating. So Dewey's reflective experience and Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy is very influential on Reardon's notion of a pedagogy of reflective inquiry, which which begins in the lived experience of the student, following Dewey and Freire. Reardon suggests that we begin the educational process with the lived experience of the student, and we engage them in a process of reflective inquiry that focuses on what she calls query posing, which is the core method. It's slightly different than asking questions. It's the questions are open-ended, and they're more like queries that encourage reflection, that encourage inquiry, and that leads to transformation to transformative learning for Reardon. The pedagogy of reflective inquiry can take on at least three different modes or forms. One is a critical reflective inquiry, and that follows closely from Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy. It pertains to the discernment of power, an understanding and critique of social institutions, an understanding of how social structures influence our lives and influence what we can become. And the development of a critical consciousness is a part of the goal of a critical reflective inquiry. The second form is ethical, a pedagogy of ethical reflective inquiry. And ethical inquiry addresses normative questions of what is right and what is good. It addresses questions of justice. It seeks ethical and normative validity in its analysis. And for Reardon, it's guided by the principles of a human rights framework. The third kind of reflective inquiry that we'll think about is what Reardon calls contemplative or ruminative. And contemplative is a self-examination of our internal moral motivation and commitment, as well as having an imaginary dimension. It pertains to reflection on what we can envision as alternative realities necessary for transformative action. So reflective inquiry also contemplates the future and what an ideal future might consist of, and how do we get there. So the contemplative reflective inquiry is an important part of the pedagogy, because if we can't envision an alternative future, then we can't create it. So those are the three kinds of reflective inquiry that Reardon suggests and that we'll explore, we'll engage in shortly. Our focus of inquiry is anti-racist teaching, and that involves racial inequity, racist policy, and racism. And that's derived from Ibram X. Kendi's work, in particular his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And in that work, Kendi offers us a number of important definitions, which I find clear and compelling. One is that racist policy. He defines racist policy as that which produces or sustains racial inequity. He defines racial inequity as in terms of equality, that when there is inequality between racial groups, then there exists racial inequality. And if there's equality, equal footing between racial groups, there's racial equity. Fourthly, if he defines racial discrimination in terms of equity or inequity, he writes, if discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. So whether discrimination is racist or not is a function of whether it is just or unjust, equitable or inequitable. A racist idea he defines as that an idea that suggests that one group is inferior or superior to another racial group. So white supremacy, for example, would be a racist idea because it asserts the superiority of a certain group over others. And then he defines racism as a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity and that are sustained by racist ideas. So racism is defined in terms of policy policies that are racist, that is, that produce or sustain racial inequity. And they are sustained by racist ideas. Racism is therefore both structurally and culturally violent. And as such, it is unjust. And we can think, following Martin Luther King, we can think of injustice, among many others, we could think of injustice in terms of dehumanization. As Dr. King wrote in a letter from a Birmingham jail, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And to deprive a person of their freedom and other rights is to reduce them to a thing rather than a person. And King went on to suggest that not only is our society potentially racist and engaged in racism, racism is also interconnected with economic exploitation and militarism, what he called the three evils, and that constitutes racist imperialism. A society that's so structured is dehumanizing. And by dehumanizing others, it's a violent system. It's harmful, and it violates the fundamental rights of democratic citizenry. Justice, from the perspective of King, is the beloved community, and it's very similar. The beloved community is a similar conception to what in Africa is called Ubuntu. For King, the beloved community was grounded in a form of love expressed by the Greek word agape. Agape is the moral disposition to respond to others with unconditional respect. It's a disposition that responds to the inherent dignity of others, and it bestows membership on all persons in an inclusive moral community. It suggests that justice requires equal respect for persons. And as Cornel West suggests, quote, justice is what love looks like in public, end quote. So anything short of mutual respect is unjustly dehumanizing. And this is very similar to the African concept of Ubuntu, which is a relational communal conception of personhood and ethics. It affirms communal relations that are grounded in mutual dignity and respect, similar to Dr. King's phrase that we are situated in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. This, I believe, expresses the idea of Ubuntu. And injustice from this perspective is a degradation of communal relations causing dehumanization. And racism is clearly a degradation of communal relations. So with those basic ideas of racism, racist policy, racial inequity, the pedagogy of reflective inquiry, justice and injustice, we can turn to our exercise for this session, and that is to engage in a process of reflection and deliberation around racial inequity and racist policy in its three modes: critical, ethical, and contemplative. So we've articulated some questions we would like you to consider in your groups, to discuss, and to record and bring back to the larger group when we reconvene. I put in the chat a link to this presentation and to these questions, which is slide 9. So you can everyone can access the presentation from that link in Dropbox. Erin, do you want to take it from here.
Yes, and just a couple of things. So when you're in your breakout group, please introduce yourselves and let people know where you're from and your interest, why your interest in anti-racism. Also, appoint someone to take notes and to share out the observations when we come back to the room. And so I expect for the discussions to last about 15 minutes. And I hope that when we come back to the room that it's not in the middle of somebody expressing a really important idea, but that does happen from time to time. So it is 5:21. So at 5:36, we will come back to the rooms. Are there any questions? All right. Let's split the groups up.